The Spotlight, shining a light on podcasts and videos that have caught our attention.
Hi and welcome to The Spotlight. My name is Jen Spiker and today I'm highlighting a video from the recent Answers in Genesis Living in Babylon Australian tour. Ken Ham and Martyn Iles visited 4 capital cities in late February and early March. They shared a series of messages building on themes across the 4 events. Today, we'll hear more of Ken Ham's message to a capacity crowd in Perth, reflecting on a university graduation speech that he once heard, where the guest speaker shared about some of her favourite books, including Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy.
The Spotlight with Jen Spiker.
If I had got up and mentioned, here's a book, the Bible, I think a lot of those young people would have said, the Bible? Well, we know that's not true. A lot of people would even say, what is the Bible? Because these days, the Bible's either taught against or not mentioned, and a lot of people haven't even heard about it. We have younger generations today, they don't know what the Bible is. So they don't understand what sin is. They don't understand who God is. And for a lot of them, I've travelled all around the world for the past 40-odd years. And one of the things I find, doesn't matter what country you go to, when they hear you on about Christianity or the Bible, they ask all these questions. Well, don't live in a scientific age. Well, hasn't science disproved the Bible? How do you know the Bible is true? Or what evidence is there for God? Well, who made God? You believe in Adam and Eve. Where did Cain get his wife? How did all the races come about if there are only 2 people to start with? Where's the evidence of the flood? Don't fossil layers prove millions of years in evolution? We know man evolved from ape-like creatures. How could the story of Adam and Eve be true? How can you believe in a loving God with all the death and suffering in the world? And didn't dinosaurs live millions of years ago and evolve into birds? And how could Noah fit all the animals on the ark? And hasn't science proved evolution is true? And isn't the Bible an outdated book of mythology? Just for interest, put your hand up if you've heard those sorts of questions. Oh, wow, that's a shock. Well, no, it's not, because they're the sorts of questions people ask today. And by the way, that's just some of them, but they mostly relate to the history in the Bible. They're all an attack on the history, that the history is not true. Christianity is based in history. If the history is not true, then how can Christianity be true? The gospel is based in history, and the history in Genesis 1 to 11. And we're told in 1 Peter 3:15, always be prepared to make a defense or give an answer. And the word defense or answer comes from the Greek word apologia, from which we get our word apologetics, which means to give a logical, reasoned defense of the faith. And so I want to challenge each one of us tonight. Don't put your hands up, just sit there and think about this. How many of us could answer those sorts of questions? Because these are the sorts of questions people ask today. The sad thing I found? Most of our churches do not raise up generations in the church to know how to answer those questions. Most do not teach apologetics. You know what happens in most of our churches? We teach Bible stories. You know what I mean by Bible stories? Jonah and the great fish, feeding of 5,000, Paul's missionary journey. Don't get me wrong, we want to teach those as true, but even the word story today has come to mean fairy tale. There are atheists that say, you learn stories at church, you learn real stuff at school. We've even got to stop using the word story. There's an incredible attack today on the Bible's history. And because most of our church leaders, most of our pastors, not all, but the majority, and the majority of our Christian academics have said Genesis is not important, doesn't matter, you can believe in evolution, you can reinterpret it, don't worry, trust in Jesus. And we wonder why so many walk away from the faith when they realize if you can't trust the history in the Bible and you can't trust the history in Genesis, how can you trust the rest? And I want to go through and just give you a few examples tonight of how to defend the Christian faith when people ask you questions. Because this is what we should be doing, raising up our kids this way. We need to be raising up our Sunday school kids, the people in our Bible studies, the people in our churches. We need to be raising them up equipped so they can defend the Christian faith. And the reason? So they point people to God's word and the saving gospel. We're not trying to prove the Bible, we're just showing that we can give an answer. Because so many times non-Christians think we can't answer the questions. And they think, see, these Christians, it's just a blind faith. And so I'm going to go through and, you could talk a lot more about each of these questions, but I'm just going to do a few real quickly. For instance, does science confirm an infinite God? Notice I don't say prove, I say confirm. Because you can't ultimately prove anything. Because we are finite beings. Only God can. Very first verse of the Bible says, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. Do you realize if that verse is not true, neither is the rest of the Bible? Do you realize the whole rest of the Bible depends on that verse being true? And we could talk about lots of things. We could talk about the laws of nature. Where'd they come from? How come there are laws? I mean, if everything evolved by chance, random processes, why do we trust those laws? Couldn't they evolve more tomorrow? How can you believe in those laws? And those laws are immaterial. If you're an atheist and you believe everything is material, where did the immaterial laws come from? Laws of nature. How do you explain that? What about the laws of logic? You know, I had a young man once, and he was at a conference, and he said, "Oh, Mr. Ham, I heard your seminar, but I still believe we all evolve by chance, random processes." And I said, "Oh, you do?" "Yes, sir." I said, "So if you evolve by chance, random processes, your brain evolved by chance, random processes, right?" "Yes, sir." I said, "If your brain evolved by chance, random processes, your processes of logic evolved by chance, random processes." "Yes, sir." I said, "If your processes of logic evolved by chance, random processes, you don't even know they evolved the right way." I said, "Son, you don't even know you're asking the right question." And he looked at me and he said, "What was the name of that book you recommended?" Because he got the point. But I want to give this example. DNA, that molecule of heredity that makes up our chromosomes, our genes, all the information that builds us, or a cat, or an elephant, or a dog. You know, DNA was first discovered as that helical structure by two British scientists, Francis Crick and James Watson, back in 1953. You know, hey, for the men in this room, I don't know about you, I have trouble remembering birthdays. My wife knows the birthday of every one of our grandkids, all our kids. She even knows mine. And she remembers all those things. And I think, how on earth does she remember all that stuff? But I have learned, when I'm thinking about, you know, for instance, in America, when I hear it's Pearl Harbor Day, 7th of December. That's my wife's birthday is on Pearl Harbor Day. That's how I remember it. And then, now how old is she? When did Watson and Crick discover the helical structure of DNA? That was in 1950, and then I figure it out. So that's how I do it. I've been over to a museum in London where you can see the actual first model of DNA that Watson and Crick actually built. You know, it was interesting. Back in 2003, on the 50th anniversary of the discovery of that molecule, Crick, now obviously they both passed on now, he was 86 then, he said, "The God hypothesis is rather discredited. Indeed," he says, "his distaste for religion was one of the prime motives in the work that led to the sensational 1953 discovery." In other words, Watson and Crick both said, they were atheists, and they said the reason they really did this research was to show the world there's no God. And you know what they said? "We found that life is built on a molecule, it's just chemistry, there's no God, there you are." But you know, we've done a lot of research on DNA, and it's not just chemistry. In fact, I have a piece of rope there with red and blue beads on the rope, and those red and blue beads spell out the word help. You all know that, right? If you know the Morse code, they spell out the word help. If you don't know the Morse code, they're red and blue beads on a rope. Now, if you had a long enough piece of rope and a lot of beads, you could write the entire Bible. But you've got to know the language. You've got to know the code. And you know, DNA, we found, is basically an information system read by a code, a language system. And actually, DNA makes the language system to read the DNA. Wow. When I was at university, I had a professor who said, "I can show you there's no God. Let's put the letters of the alphabet in a hat." I should have asked him where the letters came from, but we didn't do that. And then he passed it around the class and said, "Pull out some letters," and 3 students pulled out B-A-T, bat. Look, we got a word. Given enough time, we could get more words. Given enough time, even as remote as it seems, you must admit there's always the probability that we could get words in a sentence and eventually get the encyclopedia. There's no God. That's what happened. DNA, by chance, molecules came together. Bingo, there we have it. No God. You know what I should have asked? Who was that word a word to? Was it a word to a Dutchman, a Frenchman, a Chinese? Who is it a word? It's only a word to somebody who already has the language. See, those beads are only a word to somebody who knows the Morse code. Otherwise, they're not a word. And you know what is interesting? When you look at DNA, we found out that it has an incredible amount of information that's read by a language system, and DNA makes the language system. A German scientist, Dr. Werner Gitt, who's an information scientist, and in his book, In Beginning Was Information, he said, "There is no natural law through which matter can give rise to information." In other words, matter can't give rise to information. Information has to come from information, from an intelligence. There's zillions of bits of information in living things. Where'd it come from? Matter can't produce it by itself. There is no natural law that shows that. And a code system is always a result of a mental process. Codes only come from intelligence. If you don't put intelligence into your computer code, you know what happens. It's got to have intelligence. Do you know what DNA cries out? In the beginning, God created. And you know what the Bible says? If you don't believe in God, you are without excuse, for his invisible attributes, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly perceived ever since the world in the things that have been made. You don't believe in God, you are without excuse. It's so obvious there's a God. You know, have you ever watched those TV programs, documentary programs, and somebody, a scientist, archaeologist, goes into a cave and they find an arrowhead, like an Indian arrowhead. And they get all excited. We found an arrowhead. Somebody carved this stone. Wow. And they come out and it's almost like they're holding it in their hand as a religious relic. And they're coming out and they're holding it there. Look at this. There's intelligence. People lived in this cave. We can see the evidence. And then the same scientists look at the most complex information language system in the entire universe and they say, chance, chance, chance. And they look at an arrowhead. Intelligence. There is something wrong because they don't want to believe. You know, I often get children. I remember one conference, I had a little boy come up to me, he was about 10 years old, and he said, well, Mr. Ham, then who made God? How do you answer questions like that? We need to be teaching our children these things, answers to these questions. And I said to him, well, son, if somebody made God, you'd have to have a bigger God, right? Yes, sir. I said, now you got a problem. Yes, sir. Well, where'd the bigger God come from? You'd have to have a bigger God who made the bigger God who made God, right? Yes, sir. I said, now you got a problem. I know. Who made the bigger God? Bigger God. You'd have to have a bigger God who made the bigger God, made the big God, made God. Yes, sir. But now you got a problem. I know. Who made the bigger God? You have to have a bigger God who made the bigger God, made the big God, made the big God who made God. I said, do you realize, young man? You go back and you go back and you keep going back and you've got to get to the biggest God of all, which is the God of the Bible, the God who exists in eternity, the God who wasn't created because he is the creator. That's the only thing that logically, obviously makes sense. And you know something? The biggest God of all is the infinite God, a creator. In the beginning, God. It doesn't set out to prove God. God is there. He's the Alpha and Omega. He's always been there. But I want you to understand something else. We're finite beings. Therefore, we've got to understand there is a faith aspect to this. And I often find it's the atheists who say, you Christians have blind faith. No, it's the atheists have to have blind faith. We have an objective faith, a faith that makes sense of the laws of nature, a faith that makes sense of DNA. It's an objective faith. It is not a blind faith. It's a faith we can confirm from scientific investigation. Not only do the atheists have a blind faith, their faith lacks credulity because it's not logical. It does not make sense. When I was debating Bill Nye, and you saw a little clip there before, and he was asked the question, where did matter come from? He said, I don't know, it's a great mystery. So why is there matter? Why is there anything? Why is there energy? Where did it all come from? Well, he would rather believe in eternal matter or eternal energy, but not an eternal God. It doesn't make sense.
This is The Spotlight, and we've been hearing Ken Ham in part of a series of messages shared during the recent Answers in Genesis, Living in Babylon Australian tour. Ken went on to quote Hebrews 11. Without faith, it is impossible to please God, for those who draw near to God must believe that he exists and is a rewarder of those who seek him. I'm Jen Spiker, and next time on The Spotlight, we'll hear more of the message that Ken shared with the capacity crowd at the Perth Convention and Exhibition Centre. If you can't wait and want to watch Ken's message in full, you can do that right now in the free Vision app. Just tap the Watch tab and scroll to the Living in Babylon Australian Tour channel for this and all of the talks in this series.
For more great podcasts and videos like the one featured today, check out vision.org.au or the free Vision app.